this microphone, I'll have to stay in front of the microphone. And like Brian, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to this talk, and I think the group is a great group and is playing a very important role in psychology. And I think we're all basically mobilising around asking the kind of questions we're asking today. What is psychology? What should we be doing? And then more specifically, what about our early career progression and lots of the issues that arise from that. I'd like to thank Brian. You certainly did one thing for me, which is you hit the gender issue on the head, because I think a lot of the gender issue, which is to do with women's equality in psychology as well as in academia, a lot of times points to women as if to say it's something about women that creates this problem. And you just gave a very good example of how that simply isn't the case, and what we need to look at in terms of gender equality is look at the systems and structures and a lot of a totally environmental or contextual way of looking at gender. So I think that's not going to be part of my talk, but I'm glad you brought it up and addressed it. I think as well Brian's talk brought up, first of all, question everything, and I think probably all of us in agreement about that's a very good stand to take no matter what we're doing. The importance of values, and that's one of the things I'm going to be talking about a little bit, and maybe your distinction between whether the person has the value or the discipline is a worthwhile one. And a couple of other very interesting points about psychology, I think, which I think maybe our talks are going to be hopefully complementary, even though they might have initially looked like they were not. For me, I'll skip that bit. I'm a little bit aware of the time factor now, and I do plan to end at 11:30 because I know we have a coffee break. I don't want to have the whole day on. So just basically say, I'm going to say a little bit about critiques of psychology, but then get on to examples of new ways of doing psychology that break out of what some people see as the limitations of the way psychology does things now, and focus a little bit on examples to demonstrate how it is we can do psychology in different ways, or and I'm not really, I don't want to set it up as either or, but more to look at possibilities. I couldn't help thinking a little bit coming here to Galway, thinking back to 1985, because that's when I just finished my PhD, and Galway, I got my first job actually in UCG, what was then called UCG, University College Galway. I'd been in the States. I did my PhD in California, in Berkeley, California, so I was moving from Berkeley, California to Galway, Ireland, and it was definitely a big change. Psychology was in the old building, I forget what it's called now actually, there was only 4 of us. I had to teach 3 hours of cognitive psychology a week. I hadn't studied cognitive psychology, well, I studied as little as I could as an undergraduate, and not since. But fortunately for me, Aidan Moore, who's now in UCG, had left all his books behind in his office. In those days, there was books we used a lot, so my 3 hours of cognitive psychology were basically taken out of Aidan's books. And I kind of valued it in one way because it kind of updated me on psychology. But I was fairly immersed, I suppose, in what you might call traditional psychology. California, very, very traditional, focused on traits in the psychometric tradition, correlations and big 5 in personality, but also the so-called great trait debate, which was the person situation debate. And they had concluded, by the time I left in 1985, they had concluded that the situation definitely was important in shaping behaviour. And I look forward to a career, it's like a new psychology emerging at that time that would not just focus on the person, but focus on the situation. Give us a psychology of situations, give us a psychology of the ecology, give us a psychology of society, not just a psychology of the person, because after all, the person is in a situation. Unfortunately, that never happened, and in fact, the field of personality not only never went down that road, but regressed back to looking at personality in terms of traits and the big 5, which is what it continues to do to this day. But at that time, in 1985 anyway, there was a lot of critique of psychology coming out anyway, and I think this quote from Bulhan kind of captures some of the difficulties that people were having with psychology, because as Brian pointed out, psychology emerged as a middle-class discipline. It was Western-based. It was produced by men mostly and dominated by men over the 20th century. It reflected a class base. And as Bulhan points out here, first of all, this focus on individualism, and this is a key feature of psychological theory and research that has become a problem for applying psychology, and in particular for applying psychology to people who are marginalised and in society. And then the idea of individual autonomy. But that was just capturing this notion that there's an ideal set up for how people ought to be, which currently is held, I suppose you could say, by positive psychology. And that the individual will become the good individual through the changing the individual. And so the focus is very much on changing the individual. So there, the excessive emphasis on individual change. So where you have something, and again, Bulham was a clinical psychologist. He was African, but then went to work in Boston, working with very marginalised communities, mostly African American, and really finding, as he tried to work with people in that context, that what he saw as the individualistic models of psychology, which would now be CBT, for example, there was a disconnect. How can you apply something like CBT to people who don't speak the same language, perhaps even as you do, who don't share the same values, don't have this ideal of autonomy, are going back into very impoverished situations, and aren't engaged. And his biggest frustration in the end was, what we're doing it's not even helping the people who come to us, but the real issue is people aren't coming to us because they don't see us as helpful. And that became a strong critique of psychology around many different minority groups who found that psychology was actually reflecting the biases of white middle class people, mostly men at that time. And that there was that sort of middle class kind of complacency perhaps, an expectation about a need for achievement and responsibility and showing up on time for your appointments and working hard and taking on board and doing what you're told, and if there's something suggested, you go home and you do it. And there's an awful lot of these kinds of ways of talking and thinking reflect, they argued, a middle class bias. And in this case, Bulham, when he says cultural there, he was talking African American. But we also had a gender critique as well, again, starting with the idea of psychological theory, being created by men, representing male bias, and Freudian theory was a classic example to start with, but also even research in psychology, which kind of challenges Brian's point a little bit. Tavris arguing that for some strange reason, all the psychological tests and measures, at this time now, in the mid-80s, when male and female samples were compared, the female samples nearly always ended up scoring less, and somehow they ended up being less than the male samples. And they began to ask, were there actually built-in biases in psychological testing that set it up so that one group, in this case women, might perform less well than another group? Or, as we know from the IQ debate, are there some issues built into measurement that set it up so that one group, in this case African Americans, score lower than another group? So even the actual testing and measurement of psychology can reflect the biases of society. And also then, of course, sexism and assumptions about gender. And at that time, again, this is 1991, we had this very strong idea still of women's role being in the home, and women as mothers and carers, and that being women's primary role, and all the kinds of other assumptions about gender, which unfortunately are still here, and still manifest themselves in the form of, well, we can't really expect women to be so devoted to their careers, and therefore that's why they don't do so well. So, as with African American, as Sue Wilkinson, again, here we began to say, let's try and expand psychology a bit. Let's say, and she set it out here, looking for a psychology which properly represents women's concerns and all the diversity, because one of the points was lots of topics not being looked at, and deployment of such a psychology to address a range of inequalities, such as race and class, as well as gender. Now, again, look, today, we may look at this and go, well, of course, this is what we were doing. At that time, this was something that was only starting to happen. And then moving then to another kind of more progressive idea, let's develop psychology further and develop it with the aim of transforming people and societies, acknowledging denied potential. That's the Martine Barreau liberation psychology. And that's a paradigm that's emerged out of Latin America and has been developed in the United States and Europe. In fact, I have a PhD student working on the history of liberation psychology at this point. So 20 years later, 30 years later, we have a movement in psychology then that has aimed to develop a psychology that will address the concerns of minorities and marginalised groups, and develop, though, also move towards this idea of psychology in society. I don't have a quote here on the LGBT, lesbian, gay issue, but obviously Brian brought that up in terms of how psychology pathologized homosexuality, and as somebody who came out myself as gay in my 20s, I kind of basically ignored all that stuff. I felt very uncomfortable reading psychology and its approach to sexual orientation, the psychology of homosexuality. If it wasn't in clinical psychology, as you pointed out, it was somewhere in social or personality or somewhere. But I always felt it was objectified and pathologised. That was my experience. And that's why I suppose I identified so strongly with some of the criticisms of other marginalised groups, that to hear yourself talked about by psychologists can be objectifying and pathologising. So there's a whole LGBT critique going on, and of course the class critique, which Wilhelm refers to as well. So fast forwarding to 2015, last year in particular, I was very delighted to be asked to contribute to a book coming out of the Tavistock Centre in London about applying liberation practices in psychology and trying to envision a new way of doing psychology. So I've started with the critiques, and I'm fast forwarding, and I'm going to fill in between as to what are the issues involved in doing this kind of psychology. So what would a health service look like incorporating liberation ideas? It would not be based on the idea that something has gone wrong inside individuals. We're trying to get away from this individualistic kind of model. It would not move away from the stark realities of people's lives, desensitising people from inequality, injustice and violence, and placing sole responsibility for recovery on individuals despite their social circumstances. And so they're still linking into these critiques that have been going on, that psychology is too individualistic and acontextual, isolated, that it ignores people's social circumstances. We don't pay enough attention to not only poverty and immediate family issues, but issues like inequality, which is a broader social issue, and injustice and violence. And maybe we don't pay enough attention to the way in which these experiences play a role in psychological distress and in the reasons why people seek psychological services. So it would not ignore these realities and desensitise people or place sole responsibility for individuals, for recovery on individuals. It would join people together then, when we're moving forward, breaking down the isolation that so often comes with distress, building solidarity and healing through sharing. Given all this, creativity and community seem central to a health service grounded in liberation practice. So I've sort of given my whole talk away in one way by leaping forward to 2015, but I suppose what I want to do is point out the sort of new way of thinking that's behind this approach. That's basically saying, let's not focus just on the individual, let's take into account the social circumstances. And what I want to ask is, what does it mean to take into account the social circumstances? Because one of my arguments is going to be that as psychologists, we actually need to add on something to our training, and what that add-on is a social analysis, an understanding of society as a whole and how it works. And we have an absolutely vast array of psychological theories looking at how persons work, how individuals work, the psychology of the person. But what do we have about how society works? And we have social psychology, but that's how people work in groups. What do we have about society as a whole? What kind of understanding of society as a whole do we get from our education in psychology? I would say not enough, in fact inadequate. And I'm not saying we need to become sociologists or political scientists, but I think we need to build in some understanding of society, and it's been one of my major interests to get that sense of understanding of society. So we need some kind of analysis of the social circumstances of people's lives and put people into a bigger picture. That's one of the most important things we need to do if we're going to take on board these critiques and develop a psychology that can work with people's problems in their real lives. Okay, so how this came out of the Tavistock Centre? It was actually because of the diversity of groups that the Tavistock was dealing with. And again, it's this diversity issue that created the challenge of psychology. Refugees and asylum seekers, transgender, young offenders, young people in marginalised and deprived communities, elderly people. What they found in the Tavistock and elsewhere, this is just an example, but this is just the most recent one, they couldn't bring them into your typical psychological practice. They didn't want to go into a clinic or a medical setting, for example. So if psychological services are all set in a clinical or medical setting, right away there's a problem for a lot of marginalised groups. The one person's often coming in then, and there's a range of professionals. So you have this one person dealing with a range of professionals who are mostly middle class, and that's still the case with psychology and other health services. So if you're from these more marginalised groups, then you're looking at and sort of feeling like there's all these people over here. Very often, psychological services are supplied on a one-to-one basis as well. You have therapy, the clinical, the interview, the assessment, whatever therapy is being done, one-to-one in a private room. Very often questionnaires, tests and interviews are involved. There's verbal communication as the primary mode. There's a lot of technical language. So what they were saying in the Tavistock and elsewhere is, when you start looking at what psychologists actually do in the clinic, it's something we kind of take for granted in Western culture, that it's okay to walk into a room and reveal all your personal secrets to somebody you've never met before. And have a question and answer session where you give all the information and the other person doesn't. And never hear anything back from the person about who they are, where they live, what their life is like, or anything else. And never see them outside the clinical environment. And have to answer, the client is the one given all this information. There's lots of ways in which the way psychology works is actually quite weird when we start looking at it from if you stand back and look at the cultural assumptions that are built into it. And it's refugees and asylum seekers in particular who put these forward, because they're people coming from completely different cultures. In some cases, cultures where you very rarely have a one-to-one conversation with a stranger, where people worked as groups together, where the community was the focus of where the healing would happen, where they were traumatised, and the idea of talking about it over and over again wasn't the way their culture approached it. So I suppose working with refugees and asylum seekers brought forward a huge cultural challenge to the Tavistock. And I've somebody at the moment doing a PhD on this topic in Ireland, psychological services for asylum seekers. Some of the same issues. I know it's an extreme group in one way, asylum seekers, but what it does is it hits up against the cultural assumptions and boundaries of psychological practice. How can you, she interviewed psychologists, Irene McNulty, working with asylum seekers, and they all felt really torn around how can they, an asylum seeker comes into the psychological service, they have this kind of one-to-one interaction, they try to in some way help the asylum seeker, who then has to go back to this terrible condition of direct provision, where they are living in very deprived conditions with very little income and very little opportunity, and are basically being re-traumatised. And this is a kind of a nexus, I think, a little bit for psychology, the asylum seeker situation, because we have, first of all, a challenge to the practice of psychology and the ways in which it's done. But secondly, we have a huge social issue here, a social policy issue, about the policy we use with asylum seekers, and at the moment that's called direct provision. Are you familiar with direct provision? Yeah. So I just wanted to leave this question mark. What does psychology do with this? If we know that direct provision is re-traumatising the clients that we're dealing with, what do we do with that? And in one way, the obvious answer seems to be we take on a role of trying to change the policy of direct provision. So that gets us into policy, and that's one of the places I want to go with what I'm calling liberating psychology. Because in the end, I suppose I'm saying, let's just do a bit more than what we do at the moment to address this issue of society as a whole and the way it impacts on us psychologically. So, as I say, the Tavistock was dealing with this big range of different groupings. Again, the same issue, the critique and the challenge to its way of doing things, and then actually doing a lot of new kinds of practices, and that's what I want to talk about next, some examples of new kinds of practices. But it's not that simple a matter to just turn around tomorrow and say, right, I've been trained as a clinical psychologist to do all this stuff, and I'm in the clinic and I'm doing, or a researcher or an educator. I've been trained to operate in an institution in a particular way for particular reasons. I can't just wake up tomorrow and go, right, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do things differently. And I just walk out of the clinic and go into the community, and hallelujah, I'll be a psychologist in the community, and I can help people that way. Because once we move out of the clinic or the institution into a community, we deal with quite a few challenges. And again, I'm going to draw my own personal experience here for a bit to talk about that, because my involvement in UCD, I was in psychology, and I was invited to get involved in a community-based education program in women's studies. And that meant I was going to go from the university out into a community, and in particular an impoverished community in Clondalkin, in Dublin. And I was going to be giving a psychology course to a bunch of women who were aged between 25 and 50, who had very lived life experience and were quite somewhat political. They were involved, they wanted to take a women's studies program. So I was asking myself, well, I'm not really going to go out now and give, a course in psychology of the kinds that I might do in UCD, to undergraduates in UCD. The language wouldn't be suitable, perhaps. the approach wouldn't be suitable. There was a whole emphasis as well in women's studies on what's called participatory pedagogy, where it's not, you don't come in and transfer knowledge to a group, you engage the group in a way, in a participatory process. And I was also aware of the class issue here, power and privilege. I'm obviously middle class, I'm going out to this working class area. Now, I've been involved in a lot of politics and political activism, so I obviously had lots of contact with people from lots of different classes. But I still knew it wasn't going to be okay for me to just walk in my middle class privilege and put my bag down and start talking. And there had to be some kind of participatory process. So out of doing all of that, these are some of the issues that arise in working in communities and with people from groups and contexts that are different from your own and often less privileged than your own. Because one of the first things people deal with is this issue of critical interrogation of boundaries, power and privilege. So, and over the last 3 decades, in many different contexts, as psychologists have gone out to communities to work with people, they've had to deal with people coming back at them and saying, hold on a minute, who do you think you are? And how do you know you're not going out into a community and actually reinforcing some of the prejudices and values that are reflected in participants? So there's a lot of critical interrogation of self. Who am I in this situation? What kind of privilege do I have? How can I work in a way that's not going to reinforce some of the power inequalities that are the cause of the problem in the first place? And one of the ways of doing that is participatory. That's emerged as a kind of key theme. I suppose that's one of my strongest points to make. If we're going to work with people outside our institutions and our communities, it's got to be a partnership kind of model where we work in a participatory way, and that means dialogical, meaning conversation and listening, and relational and ethical, meaning if we're going to relate to people and work with people, then obviously there's an ethical component to that, because we're always asking ourselves, no matter what our context, is what we're doing beneficial, could it be harmful, how are we working in a positive way? I've mentioned social awareness there already, but having a social analysis, having a full understanding, so in this case, for example, in my case, learning about poverty and how poverty impacts on people. And it may be something we think we know about, but actually as middle class people, I certainly didn't know that much about poverty. Critically, then for a variety of methods. So nobody's going to go out and use one single method. And in this case, with teaching, not say only use a talking method. And also always be sure to be embedded in community and to acknowledge the social connections that people are making. So these are just some basic themes that have come out of efforts to take psychology out of institutions and into communities, out of clinics and into communities. It's about seeing yourself as a social actor in that situation, not just as a professional, but as a social actor operating in a situation. So just to talk a little bit then, I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience with education and then participatory research and then clinical counselling and psychotherapy. Now, I've emphasised participatory, so if I was practising what I preach here, I'd press the pause button and I'd start looking for feedback from the floor. And I would be really interested to hear actually what some of you have to say about this question that we've been asked to address, the place of psychology in Irish society. I would really hope, and I plan to end, and I'm condensing my talk because I started late, and also want to hear what you have to say. What do you think? And especially the points that I'm making about moving psychology out of institutions into communities, and as we see later, taking on a role in society as a whole. So in my experience anyway, in the end of the day, I ended up doing a lot of this community-based education, and I also did a lot of workshops in community contexts, working not just with women in marginalised communities, but also lesbian studies and lesbian groups, which included transgender women, and also other community women's groups. And out of all of that, along many, many years of experience working with groups. I did, learn the methods. In fact, when I went out to Clondalkin that first time, I did a training in group work actually, in community-based group work. And the first time I went out to Clondalkin, the first thing you do in community-based group work, you set up your circle, and you do an opening round, and you ask for expectations. And as somebody who's used to working with undergraduates in UCD, if you ask students, undergraduates in particular, anything, you basically don't get much of a response back, no matter how hard you try. So I was kind of like, how am I going to get them to talk? And I go into the room, they're sitting around, I have my flip chart, what are your expectations? Vroom! They had no difficulty telling me what their expectations were. They wanted me to be on time for one thing, which obviously I was. But they wanted clear course outline, for example, clear assessment issues. They were very clear about what they wanted out of this and how they expected me to behave. And it was a big learning from the viewpoint of, I can let go here, we can create this together in this situation. So mixed methods, big emphasis as well on experience, and that people's lived experience is a huge source of expertise, especially if it's reflected on. So in that situation, it was dialogical, participatory. I used a lot of different methods, including drama, small groups, role plays, group work, and in the end, creating the knowledge together through a combination of input and experience. One of my big kind of contributions and learnings out of this, and which is where I've published a lot and has been taken up a lot, is on this issue of social analysis. That in fact we have to look at society as a whole when we're working with psychological issues. And that so society as a whole is actually a pyramid. You know, it's a class-based system, it's a hierarchy. There is an elite at the top of the hierarchy, and this has become more and more obvious over the years of austerity. It's what I call a system of domination, and I talk about 6 modes of control: violence, economic exploitation, political exclusion, cultural control, control of sexuality. So it's quite a strong analysis. And what I find with this is, when I'm dealing with marginalised groups, totally no problem, absolutely, yes, it's a pyramid, there's an elite at the top, they hold the power, they do exploit us economically, the political system works to exclude people, culture is owned and controlled by a particular group of people, sexuality is regulated and controlled, and I don't want to go into the details. The main point I want to make here is the social analysis involves acknowledging society as a hierarchy and one that operates through marginalisation and exclusion. And with that comes experiences of exclusion, experiences of prejudice, experiences of violence, experience of economic insecurity, experiences of helplessness and being excluded from the political system. These are all the social conditions of people's lives. And these social conditions have a psychological impact. So my first point is an understanding of the social conditions. And what are the psychological impacts? And this is my second point. This would be coming up, again, this is a kind of some bringing together of many workshops, asking people what kind of emotions and how do you respond to these kinds of social conditions. And I suppose my main point, this is obviously, I call them vulnerabilities. The main point is to look at that and say, well, does that look familiar? Low self-esteem, grief, cynicism, controlling, rejection, hurt, self-blame, confusion, ambivalence, and void. Does that look familiar? To those of you maybe in clinical psychology, that might look, a lot of those might be the kinds of responses that you might be dealing with in a clinical context, and that might actually end up resulting in some kind of diagnosis. Whereas what we're looking at here is an actual reaction to lived social conditions. But they're not the only reactions, and they're what I call the vulnerabilities. Because one of the big themes of liberation psychology is it's not just about we're oppressed and we're terrible. It's that we live with oppression. And of course we have these reactions, but we also have developed strengths and ways of living with oppression. I think courage is on that list because I was kind of struck when Brian mentioned courage. Because courage, as you rightly point out, can be overdone, but in situations of living with oppression and marginalisation, courage becomes something that's really valued, and it's something that enables people to live with and admire them, and to live with oppression and to take action around that. But here's a good long list of strengths that people said, we believe that we've developed these qualities as a result of being part of a group that has lived with oppression, has been marginalised, has experienced prejudice, social exclusion, and so forth. A humour, for example, would come up a great deal. We'd never have got through it if we didn't have a sense of humour. A sense of solidarity. I don't feel I'm not on my own. I know that I'm with other people. And that sense of solidarity is a very important part of dealing with oppression and marginalisation. And a lot of these qualities, I think, are very good qualities, and qualities that we would actually admire and would see as a source of strength and part of effective functioning, if we want to use that language. So my first point is about the social analysis. My second is a lot of psychological distress is linked to that social level, but it's not just, it doesn't just result in distress, there's also sources of strength. And I know that the recovery model, for example, in positive psychology is building more on this idea of working with strengths. And then the third piece that I would focus on a lot, and is very part of liberation psychology, is about transformation, focusing people on where they want to make changes, and that's the focus on transformation. I'm going to skip that at the moment just because of the time factor. But the end point I want to make from my experience was that first of all, people really valued it when there was a clear analysis of oppression. So you go in and you say there's a hierarchy, there's exclusion, violence, poverty and so forth. People don't go, oh, I don't want to hear that, and I'm even more oppressed than I was before you came in. It's the other way around. People know this. So when you come in with a clear understanding and a clear analysis, you are just giving affirmation to an experience that people already have. You are actually validating an analysis that people already have. So there's this very strong, if you like, cognitive component here around a social analysis. That when you have a clear social analysis, you're really actually acknowledging the reality of people's lives. And they themselves often have clear analysis, and the two together can make it even clearer. The other piece out of all of this was that the way in which people began to see the way their oppression did actually impact psychologically. So anger would be a very good example. Somebody might be full of anger, or experience a lot of anger, and often direct it towards their partner or family. And through these workshops would say, oh, my anger is, I'm really angry because of what's going on out there. And that insight actually then enabled them to work better with the anger in their personal life. So insights into personal issues and subtle patterns of oppression, ways in which oppression worked in everyday life. And that stopping self-blame was another very important outcome that again has recurred over and over again in liberating psychology work. That people, instead of blame, because part of oppression is to feel inferior, to feel it's my fault, to self-blame. And to actually be able to say, no, actually it's not my fault, it's something that's going on in society or in the system, is a much better position for most people than self-blame. And then increased confidence, understanding of change, and likelihood to get involved in change. So I've just run through there, hopefully briefly enough, the work that I've done, how I've done it, and what the outcome of it has been, and saying that this is just one example of many where psychologists are going out working with people in different ways to work with the impact of oppression and hopefully work towards transforming that. I put a lot more examples into the PowerPoint show that I'm going to be able to actually talk about, but just to give an international example of the same kind of thing, using education, here we have a group of men looking at men's violence. And the same kind of idea, let's do a social analysis, look at the way in which the system or society as a whole impacts on gender and why it is that men are more violent than women. Talk in groups about that and look at how it impacts on us and see what we can do to change. And it's an educational kind of program. So there are examples of education. Moving on then to research, there's participatory research, it's research that involves going out into the community and working with groups to develop their research and understanding. So in other words, you're actually again getting out into the community and you're seeing research not as a sort of way of finding the truth, but as a way of working with people to change. And I don't know why I didn't put participatory action research there, because that's the model, PA, or participatory action research. A model of research that's about people participating in the research as part of a team doing the research on their own behalf. And the main point I want to make there is that, the different kinds of methods that are used. For example, the use of art and mosaic, the use of photo voice. Photo voice, for example, you go out into the community, you give the group you're working with a camera. And somebody in Dublin actually just did this recently, Kathy Callagher, with a group of youth, gave them a camera, take photographs all over, bring it into a group, and then have a focus group discussion about this and as a means of getting people to talk about their experience and about their lives and about what their lives are about. So these are all ways of getting around that traditional psychological method, which is the one-to-one verbal mode, and using our art and other kinds of modes to involve people in research. An Irish example there, Martina Carroll, PhD, went into a working class community in Dublin to work on racism and had 3 different groups, women's groups, meeting over several weeks, and they created a mosaic. And in the process of creating that mosaic, they talked about racism, they talked about the Irish experience of emigration, immigration. They then selected the components that they wanted to put together into a mosaic and to create a mosaic that would represent their understanding of racism. And over the course of that, so if we have the verbal mode in terms of group discussion, but also this non-verbal mode, the creation of a mosaic. And the outcome then, greater understanding of racism, awareness of racism, group solidarity, community participation. The group went on to give an exhibition, for example. So it was a research piece, that was the initial starting point, to research racism, rather than take a racism questionnaire and administer it, which is obviously a very important part of researching racism as well. But this one was aiming towards empowerment. How to do that, involve people in the research as participants, use different kinds of methods beyond the verbal, and engage people, if possible, in some kind of action for transformation. And that will be the key elements of participatory action research. So I'm just going to skip on now to psychotherapy, counselling, and clinical, and look at the liberation practice there. And I already mentioned the Tavistock. I'm going to go back to that. But bearing in mind now all that I've just said, which is really about having a social analysis and having an understanding of psychological reactions to that, and having a focus on change, the three components of a liberation approach. This is what Goodman has to say about what should be part of psychotherapy, counselling, and clinical, and which is really saying when we're working with people in a clinical setting, in other words, the kinds of people who come to psychological services. What we want to add on to our practice, or build into our practice, is this, what she calls consciousness raising, helping clients understand the extent to which individual and private problems are rooted in larger historical, social and political forces. Now there's actually quite a lot in that when you start looking at it. Because what she's saying is, if we take any individual symptom, whether it be depression, anxiety, or OCD, whatever it is, that is there is an individual level to that, and that's the part that psychology works with all the time. But is that enough? Because there's always more than just that individual level. There is the context of that for that particular person, depending on what group they're coming from. And to understand that social context, we need to understand these historical, social and political forces. We need to get back to what I was saying, a social analysis as well as a psychological analysis. So that we understand somebody coming from poverty, what poverty and class issues are about, somebody who's LGBT, what homophobia and LGBT issues are about, somebody coming from a disability, what the issues are about that. What are the social issues as well as the psychological issues? So that's the awareness and knowledge that we need. And then one step more, to bring that into the working with the client, to actually help the client themselves to make those links. Because the argument here again is that when clients see the link between their symptoms, as we might call them, of say depression, when they see the link between their depression and the social forces that are operating, that actually is helpful. It actually helps clients to see those links. It shifts, just what I was saying, what I found in my own work with, but has been found in this literature on counselling, social justice counselling, multicultural counselling, feminist counselling, liberation counselling, they're all looking at the same idea. When we make these connections, we're helping clients, which is quite a claim, I know that. So what kind of practices then in the clinical context? Well, one is outreach, because people tend not to, again, if they're marginalised and discriminated against, have a reluctance, there are more barriers to those kinds of groups going into medical and clinical settings. So outreach means reaching out, and I'll give an example of that in a moment. Participatory, again, working more on a participatory partnership basis with people in dialogue, rather than the expert basis. Using a variety of methods, which I'll talk about in a moment. Making links with the community, that's the same kind of idea as outreach, so that instead of seeing our clinic as situated within its hospital or HSE or whatever setting it is, that there's a link out to a community in some form or other. The social awareness I've already mentioned. And with all of those elements, and I'll give you some examples in a moment, what the finding is that there's greater engagement with services, so there's more people coming in to use the services when these practices are followed. And there's also better outcomes as far as they can be measured in a clinical setting. So taking the Tavistock case, and I'm focusing particularly here on people using liberation methods, because there are a lot of different examples, I'm sure, in the Irish context of clinical programs and services linking to communities, but explicitly using liberation methods. For example, working with clients here using music to make record music, filmmaking, use of social media, group discussion, one dialogue writing, using lots of different methods, in other words, again, away from the verbal one-to-one. Here's an example of Weppy and Hughes working aware that a lot of young people were in need of their services, but weren't actually engaging. That was their starting point. How do we get more engagement? So their aim was to generate dialogue between young people and those providing the services. So they, as clinical psychologists, are there with their service and they're saying, right, where is the young people? Outreach. So the first point is to actually go out into the community and look to make connection with the client group. In this case, seeking out young people through local youth clubs with the aim of filming and recording. So they literally went out of their centre, their institute, into the local youth club as clinical psychologists, basically saying we're here to make connection. They then managed to engage with a group, only two people, in which two clinical psychologists went out into the local youth clubs. They got two people on board, which is all it took to actually generate the project, because even one person on board would be enough to generate the project. Got two people on board who in turn recruited other young people through internet and social media. And by using internet and social media, they were showing some familiarity with that mode of interaction, namely internet and social media. The youth themselves then created a script and they made a film. One of the roles that psychologists can play is to make resources available. They showed the film then in the local area and used that to generate discussion about psychology and about to generate discussion about their lived experience, and that in turn fed in through the practice in the centre. So this entire project ended up educating the clinical psychologists much more about the living conditions of their client group and engaging the client group more. And in other words, they literally got more people coming into the service and felt they could work more effectively with the client group. So it's just a single example of a practice that just set out to expand itself a little bit by going out into the community. And I'm aware now that I've got a couple of minutes left. I did want to talk about psychology in Ireland, and I suppose I've already talked a little bit about psychological services then, but to think about ways what we can do to push our service, to develop our service through outreach and engagement and participation and other kinds of methods to become more effective, because inclusion and accessibility and outreach are probably the key elements of a service that is going to reach out to its different groups. But to move, I know I'm moving quickly now, but then the whole issue of community psychology. And where is that, and why isn't it here? Because in fact, in Britain, for at least 20 years now, there's been an argument that clinical psychology needs to be community psychology, that there needs to be some moving, there needs to be some link. And I think surely it is time for this to start happening in the Irish context. I've already given community-based education and participatory research, but psychological services, surely we're moving to the point of community health centres and psychology working in that kind of context into the future, I'm talking about now. And I just skip on from that because I know I'm covering a lot here, but I want to go on to the professional society. PSI to me is a sort of a key player in this idea of psychology playing a role in society. And PSI up to now has and it continues to aim to do that. It obviously looks after the professional interests of the members, and that's what you're doing with your group as well. But even from what I've heard already, your group is also asking questions about the role of society. Equality issues, for example, were mentioned. PSI has a policy on equality and inclusive practice. But I want to specifically focus on this as a good example, I think, of the different levels that psychology can operate at. Obviously, it's close to my heart because I was involved in developing these guidelines. So PSI has developed guidelines for good practice with lesbian, gay and bisexual clients. And it does what in a way is the strength of psychology, I think, which is draw on the research that's been done in the most objective way, as well as the more subjective ways, to put together an understanding of sexual orientation, homophobia, and all the issues that are involved in LGBT. And to then use that scientific base, if you like, or that evidence base, to develop guidelines for good practice. So far, so good. And a directory of services, websites, and publications. So the development of guidelines like that, to me, is a very good example of psychology doing a social good, if you like. But what about one step further? Should PSI develop a policy on same-sex marriage, for example? There is a referendum coming up on marriage equality. People are going to be asked, do they support same-sex marriage, yes or no? On the basis of these guidelines, on what basis does psychology do that is part of what I'm asking. I personally, obviously, I think psychology should, I think the PSI should step forward and say that we support gay marriage. Because it's a form of discrimination, I would argue, to say no to gay marriage. And discrimination, in turn, as we know, impacts on people's psychological functioning. So that you can make a psychological argument, but you even have to And if it's relevant to psychology and psychological functioning, shouldn't PSI be making public statements? So that's one of my questions to ask. We've done the guidelines, but do we now take the next step and actually come out as in policy? And we can make the same argument about refugees and asylum seekers. Should PSI be coming out against direct provision when we know that direct provision is impacting negatively on people's mental health? And in other words, is there a bigger role for PSI in society as a whole through policy and debate, as well as through looking after our own interests? At which point I conclude that yes, in my view, there is a bigger role. That's the role that psychology, if we broaden our view of ourselves to see ourselves as embedded in a social system, and that social system is linking to our psychological functioning, then we want to broaden what we do, in my view, to change not just individuals, but aim to change society as well, so that we can, in a longer term view, create a better society where people will have better well-being. Okay, so that would be my conclusion. And I don't know if I have time now to ask anybody, but could we have 5 minutes? Yeah, I'd really be interested to hear what you think yourselves about this theme of the place of psychology in Irish society. Can we, should we be going out into communities and doing the kind of outreach that I'm talking about? Should we be developing public policy and playing a role in public debate? Anybody got suggestions or comments?
Yeah, I'm interested in the idea of consciousness raising.
Yeah.
And I happened to be at the European, this actually ties to some of Brian's stuff as well. Because I was at the European Conference on Positive Psychology during the summer,
right.
And a guy called John Helliwell, he is the director of their kind of grand life satisfaction international survey of, I don't know, 147 countries or something like that. And one of one of the things he really highlighted in his speech about global life satisfaction and all this was that look how great Ireland is. We've had this great. He was talking about how great his regression model is that he's developed that can predict life satisfaction for 5 years for countries, and he's like, and then obviously the global recession happened, and that kind of threw off his regression model, which kind of irked him, and he was like, but his point was, but look at Ireland. Ireland stayed where I expected it to be. It was resilient, and their life satisfaction didn't change despite the terrible circumstances. And look at Italy and Portugal and Greece and Spain, and all of them have terrible life satisfaction now compared to where we expected them to be. But Ireland didn't move. Yay for Ireland. And I tried to challenge him on that, but I didn't get a chance, unfortunately. And I sent him an email about it, but he didn't get back to me either. But he said I think it's because they have such great social support in Ireland, and they come out high on social support measures of social support, and that's why they did so great. And there was never any question of the values that they were putting on this. What is it really a great thing to not have any dip in life satisfaction when there's something so turbulent happening in society? So I just thought that was interesting. For him, it was just they're great, and it's probably because of social support, rather than any sort of questioning of maybe Spain and Italy and Greece had the appropriate reaction to the situation. I don't know what you think.
Well, I'm taking it as a point, and I think I wish somebody would do some research on this actually, because Irish satisfaction and well-being and happiness and all these measures are always high. They were high in the 80s when there was a recession. They're high in the 2000s. They don't vary depending on what's going on socially. So to me, that's an issue of measurement more than it is an issue of what's going on in Irish society. Or are we?
It's just an Irish thing when you're
That's what I mean.
Say you're grand.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone's always grand. Yeah, I think that's where I'd be going with it. It's a social desirability. No matter what the circumstances, everything's fine. And that's what we put on into these social surveys, and that's why they never change.
And would consciousness raising help with that? kind of.
Well, now we're getting into the Irish psyche and Irish culture, and that's a huge issue right there. Consciousness raising, making the connection between how you're feeling and what's going on in the social environment. Yes, I think it would be really worthwhile in this context. And I think there's a little bit of that happening, which is that people are saying, yes, because of austerity, there's higher suicide rates, for example. And there's a good understanding emerging, I think, that these social conditions really impact on people psychologically. And then the reverse of that is when people are dealing with their psychology, asking themselves, well, how is this linked to austerity, rather than saying there's something wrong with me and I need to fix it. So that would be the difference between the two. One is saying, I'm depressed because there's something wrong with me and I can fix myself by thinking positively or doing mindfulness or whatever. The other is saying, I'm depressed, well, at least part of it is because of what's going on in society. And shifting out of that into more anger and agency kind of stuff, that would be a liberation, consciousness raising kind of approach. Any other? Yeah.
I was just, about going into the community, and there's a project in Ballymun, and it's into psychology, but when the towers were coming down and the city council wanted to go in to help people to adapt to not living in towers and then living in houses, and there's a project out there called CAFTA, and two ladies kind of headed it up, and they were from the area. So the city council were afraid even to go into the towers, even to start the discussion with the people. But these ladies were from there and were completely accepted by the people. Some of the stuff they had issues about security, and so the city council wanted the police to come and talk to them, but these people didn't want to talk to the police, so these ladies kind of came in and were the mediators. And it's just, interesting what you're saying about diversity in psychologists and from different socio-economic backgrounds. People who come from certain areas maybe are able to more easily connect to the community, so if you don't have a representation across all of the socioeconomic backgrounds, then maybe it's more difficult to go into the communities.
Yeah, it is a little bit, but as well as that, it isn't that difficult. But I think the main thing is to make the connection, get the dialogue going. And that was the title of the Tavistock book, actually, something dialogue. Use the word dialogue to go in and look for somebody who can become an ally to you and you to them in the process of engaging with the community. Whereas a lot of times psychologists tend to go, professionals tend to go in as, I'm in here now, I'm the professional, I'll talk to you. This is about, would somebody come and help me as a professional, one of you in the community, come and help me to work with this community in a listening and dialogical manner. So it's a different process. And unfortunately, that class issue it gets set up a lot, which is that the middle class people are afraid, are not allowed, or in some way excluded from participating in a working class or deprived situation for very good reasons to do with what I've just described, which is I'm coming in to tell you. And in fact, what we need is obviously dialogue. Because one of the big points of liberation would be, as professionals, we have resources and experience and skills that can be of help.
I think it would be great to see psychology becoming a bit more vocal, the PSI in particular,
Right.
about different social issues of relevance to Irish society.
Yeah.
There's two questions on that. How do we decide which issues to take on?
Yeah.
Psychology was remarkably, or PSI thought was remarkably quiet about the abortion legislation, whereas psychiatry was quite vocal about that, in my personal opinion. And secondly, where does psychology come down on these issues? Personally, I'm in favour of gay marriage, but from Brian's talk, I need to divorce my own personal opinion from that which is correct. So how do we decide how much empirical research is enough for PSI to say, yes, we need to vote? Is it enough that the APA came out in favour of it? Should we just follow along with that? So it's what social issues to take on, and then how do we decide that, yes, there's enough evidence behind it?
Well, it's a tough one, that one, because first of all, do we need research? So that would be the first question, what's the role of research? And if there is research, great. For example, on the issue of children and same-sex parenting, there's a very substantial amount of research that's very consistently showing the same outcomes for children with same-sex parents, 2 women or 2 men, compared with heterosexual parents. Very substantial research on that. So at least we know we have a good basis on that in that area for saying the research is of this nature. When it comes to, but then sometimes it just is a matter of values. So when it comes to gay marriage, for example, if you take the children out of the equation, then we're talking about 2 people who want to marry. It's a relationship issue. Or what's the issue? gay marriage. What's the research that could apply to it? That's what is the issue. It's purely values, prejudice, I don't know what it is. Why shouldn't two same-sex people be allowed to marry the same way that two same heterosexual people marry? What's the issue there? The only arguments that they can come up with are to do with breaking down the institution of marriage and undermining marriage and all this kind of stuff. There's no evidence base for it really, is there? So therefore, what are we saying? Well, are we saying it's discrimination? Are we saying we are valuing same-sex relationships less? In which case, then maybe psychology comes into the picture. Because to value a same-sex relationship less, arguably, is to lower the self-esteem or imply in some way that people are less. And I suppose now we get to values again, where the fundamental values of psychology would be to value everybody equally. Everybody is of equal value. That would be a value of psychology, it seems to me. So if we're coming from a value base like that, that gives us a basis for saying something. But a value base isn't always based on evidence, so I'm not sure. I think we have the evidence and the evidence should be objective. That piece I'm agreeing with. I don't know if we can leave out the values though. And maybe, yeah, exactly.
Actually, I mean, I think it's a very difficult question, and I'm not necessarily going to answer it very effectively. But there can also be situations where the empirical research might hint at a downside, but it's still the right thing to do. So last year I visited Saudi Arabia, and there's a big discussion there about should women be allowed to drive, and one of the arguments is it would be safer if they didn't, because there wouldn't be any car crashes and so on. It's in fact for their own safety that we want them to stay in their own houses all the time, or else only go places when they're accompanied by improved male chaperone. So you can certainly gather empirical evidence to demonstrate that that's correct, that fewer women drivers emerge in car crashes if they're not allowed to drive. But that's using the empirical data to support the argument you've already decided in your head. It's not intrinsic to the empirical data. So I would be inclined to refer back then to this importance of separation between what you would like to happen and what the data can show. And the data then is objective or separate from that, and can if you're right, can be used and is available to you to use in that way. For PSI, I remember when I was president of PSI, there was the discussion about whether suicide was an appropriate risk factor to take into account in deciding whether a woman should be allowed to have an abortion. And there was, I was pursued by the media for comment, and the discourse at the time, what we provided back by comment was, there's no evidence to say that suicide isn't, or is such a risk factor. That suicide, in our mind, is as much of a danger to a person's life as a physical illness. But that was too subtle for them. They just wanted us to say, are you in favour of yes or no on this? And our point was, we don't distinguish between mental health, physical health. A risk to life is a risk to life, whether it's a physical disease or an intention to take your own life. So sometimes you can't win because they don't want the actual complicated answer, they want a simple answer. So my sense would be that PSI could adopt a role of a representative body as well as a professional body, and have some mechanism for members to petition for positions to be taken on social issues, not necessarily entirely evidence-based positions. If it's a professional body, it should have a representational role as well as a scientific one.
Yeah, I think that's where we should have a representational role. Yeah, I think we'll probably agree to that. And maybe, we need more discussion about how that can happen. Exactly. Yeah. And at this point, we continue the conversation over coffee.
One second.